Modern buildings are ugly. Well, that's what the opinion polls suggest. But is this true? And if so, what's the story behind it? I'm Ben Henderson, and welcome to Here for the History from BBC Sounds, the show where we uncover the backstories behind everyday life. Today, we'll hear how a Swiss architect turned Britain's establishment against traditional architecture, and how his followers rebuilt British cities in the hope of creating a better society. For some, modern architecture is a crime against the public realm. For others, it's iconic. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, hype and subscribe so you never miss out. So Alice, a few months ago I got chatting to my absolutely lovely neighbour. He's called Peter, and it turns out he's really into the local history of our area. So we were chatting, and then he pointed to this massive government tower block that looms over the road and is completely out of keeping with the rest of the area.
Ah, yes. You've given a picture of it here to me. It's pretty bland, covered in some kind of shiny metallic layer. I suppose it was presumably supposed to look quite futuristic at one point, but now just looks a bit dated, a bit tired, perhaps.
Yeah. So Peter asked me, do you know what used to be there? And I had no idea. So he took out his phone and showed me. And it turns out on the site used to be this cinema. It was called the Regal Super Cinema.
Ah, and we also have some photos of this. And this has a lot more personality, I think you could say. Is this a kind of Art Deco style? We've got a mix of modern, boxy, geometric shapes, but also elements from the past, some classical style pillars there above the entrance, and this incredibly grand auditorium. Oh, you must be gutted it's not there anymore, Ben. What happened?
Yeah, well, sadly it burnt down in the 1950s. And then it was replaced by the government building that looks a lot more functional. And in survey after survey, the British public say they strongly prefer traditional architecture to modern architecture. So there's, in 2021, a poll that showed people 5 modern civic buildings and 5 traditional ones and asked them to rank, from first to last. And when the results came in, the top 5 buildings were all traditional and the bottom 5 were all built after 1960.
Okay, but should we establish perhaps at this point, what do we mean by modern architecture? I mean, what does that look like?
Okay, so by modern or modernism with a capital M, modernist architecture, I'm talking about a building style that emerges in the early 20th century in Europe, although its roots go further back. And it's brought about firstly by new building technology. So it uses modern material like steel and concrete and glass rather than traditional materials like stone, brick, wood, that sort of thing. And then in terms of style, modern buildings often have flat roofs, and their surfaces, crucially, have very little ornament, so very little decoration like you might get on, say, St Pancras Station or an old Gothic building like that. Plus, they're generally quite utilitarian. So usually everything about the design serves a functional purpose, and this is very important.
Okay, so I'm thinking about skyscrapers, about concrete university buildings, often the library, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I had a very modernist library at my university. And I think this is really important because architecture is the one cultural form that you can't just ignore. If someone paints a painting you don't like, you can just not go to the exhibition or look the other way. But buildings are imposed on us whether we like them or not.
Some people do like modern architecture, don't they? I mean, there are some quite popular ones like the Barbican is springing to mind, or even skyscrapers in London like the Shard. That's quite popular with some people.
Yeah, some people do like them. Plus, there are examples of modern reworkings of old buildings that have proved very popular. For example, Coventry Cathedral's rebuild after the war is often praised. But the point remains, if you look at certain polling, most of the public say they don't like it.
Okay, that's interesting. And there is another thing about architectural history and looking at architecture today is that there is a bit of a survivor's bias, isn't there? So the most beautiful buildings from the past tend to be the ones that last to the present, that still survive.
Yeah, good point. And another thing you could say in defense of modern architecture is that architectural styles do go in and out of fashion. So, for example, people criticize St Paul's and the Palace of Westminster when they were built. And I think if not universally, but hugely popular today. So it just shows, things can change.
So perhaps in centuries to come, people will have as much affection for modern buildings as you and me do for a lovely medieval Gothic cathedral. Who knows?
Possibly, Alice. Anyway, this debate can get very heated because people often don't compare old and new buildings fairly. So supporters of modernism rightly point out that modern housing blocks didn't replace, lovely Victorian manors. They usually replace really awful slums. And in doing so, modern blocks improve the living conditions of huge numbers of people. And we want to be, as fair as possible. So rather than focusing on housing, which deserves its own episode, we're going to compare non-residential buildings. So think museums, university libraries, shopping centres, offices, that sort of thing. And we're going to find out how and why those buildings came to be designed in a way that some people regard as ugly.
Okay, Ben, this is a fascinating topic. I'm here for the history. Let's go.
Chapter 1, Ornament and Crime. So, Alice, we start in Vienna in 1910. A group of students are gathered for a meeting of a society they're members of, which celebrates the latest artistic ideas. Now, one of these speakers is an Austrian man in his late 30s called Adolf Loos, and he delivers a lecture titled Ornament and Crime.
Oh, sounds quite sinister and
Yes.
gripped.
So, in this lecture, this Austrian chap, Loos, basically rages against the prevailing artistic and architectural styles of the times, particularly one called Art Nouveau, which is all about sinuous lines, asymmetry, and lots of flowery decoration.
Yes, and Art Nouveau, that's a fascinating moment in architecture. Probably a good example is the buildings by Gaudi in Spain, and they're really weird. I mean, they look like buildings which have been warped or maybe melted in the sun. They're kind of surreal. It's not symmetrical. It's not really ordered in the way that many other classical buildings are, but all of the time still using modern materials.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about imitating the natural shapes of the natural world.
Yeah.
Yes, but Loos, in his essay he's giving or his lecture he's giving, he argues that handmade ornament or decoration of objects that you might see on an Art Nouveau building. So, and he's talking about furniture, buildings, whatever. He says ornament is essentially backwards and immoral. Because in his opinion, the need to decorate things is essentially childish, and it goes out of fashion very quickly. If you think, tastes can change. One day that jacket might be in, but next week, Alice, I'm afraid it might be out.
No, I don't believe it.
Yeah, well, if I was Adolf Loos, I'd say the time and money you've spent decorating things or buying things that are decorated, that's completely wasted as soon as it goes out of fashion. Instead, modern buildings, furniture, and objects should essentially be designed using modern methods just to fulfill their function. And this idea about prioritizing function over decoration and ornament, this idea would go on to be hugely influential on the look of our modern buildings and cities.
Right. Okay. So he is really turning the dial here towards a world of being more practical, more functional,
Absolutely.
less embellished.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we've got to skip forward 10 years to November 1920. So this is just after the First World War. We're in Paris, and ideas are kind of swirling around about how to make society better, for forging a new world after the horrors of war. Now, a Swiss architect called Charles-Édouard Jeanneret is staying up late, beavering away on a new magazine he's founded. It's called L'Esprit Nouveau, or The New Spirit in English. And as you can probably tell from that title, he's all for throwing out the old ways of doing things. He's read Loos's essay, Ornament and Crime, and he absolutely loves it. So he publishes it in the magazine and writes his own radical articles under a pseudonym, Alice. And that pseudonym is Le Corbusier.
Oh, okay. The famous architect. Oh, wow. I didn't realize that. So hang on. Charles-Édouard Jeanneret is actually the real name of Le Corbusier. And he was famous for those rectangular white buildings. He's a big name in architecture, isn't he?
Well, yes, Le Corbusier would go on to be probably the most influential and certainly one of the most controversial architects of the 20th century.
And that pseudonym, where does that come from? Do we know?
Well, not 100% sure. So it seems to be a version of a name one of his ancestors had, but it also might be a nod to the French word for crow. So we think the name means like the crow-like one. And, perhaps it reflects his features. I mean, he does have a slightly aquiline, slightly arched nose, very kind of defined features. So I think I could see that. Maybe he saw himself as a bit crow-like and thought, you know what, that suits me.
He sounds an eccentric. Tell me more about him. Let's get into it.
So Le Corbusier is born in 1887 in a small town in the mountains in Switzerland. Apparently, he's brought up in a very austere Protestant environment, so that may have influenced his dislike of lavish decoration. Who knows? He becomes an architect and he moves to Paris, aged 30 in the 1920s, which is when he starts this magazine. And from then, he begins to lay out in various publications his vision for the urban landscape of the future, and it's truly radical, Alice. He basically says the old higgledy-piggledy European cities need to go. The way they're laid out is way too inefficient. The buildings are crumbling and overcrowded. And all this mess is obviously absolutely terrible for the people living in them. And so instead, he wants to embrace modern technology to mass produce new cities that improve people's lives. So he proposes bulldozing the historic centre of Paris and building in its place a series of absolutely enormous towers. And the idea was that people could, in these towers, live in spacious flats away from the streets, which is reserved for cars on these massive highways. And baked into the whole plan is the idea that no money should be wasted on decoration. Buildings must be standardized, functionality is king. And his famous line that everyone remembers is, "A house is a machine for living in."
Wow, I mean, this is pretty radical to bulldoze the centre of Paris. I mean, I do love Paris today. I think it's quite a beautiful city, so I'm personally glad that didn't happen. And it might be hard for people to get their heads around how radical that was for the time, because I suppose we are used to buildings that do somewhat resemble those ideas. But back then, cities didn't have huge tower blocks. The car was very much in its infancy at this point, and aesthetically, these new buildings made of steel and glass would have seemed akin to, I don't know, spaceships landing from a different world.
Absolutely. He's proposing a complete transformation of the urban landscape and the way people live. And his writings would go on to be hugely influential on the following generations of Western architects.
Okay, fascinating. So how did his ideas catch on? How did it all spread?
Well, the historian Simon Jenkins writes a very vivid account of this in his History of British Architecture. So Le Corbusier had a pretty magnetic personality. He's a bit of a mad genius type, So apparently he refused to work in the mornings because they were reserved for paintings.
Wow, he wouldn't do that well in most jobs today, I think. Sounds like a diva. Is he a diva?
I haven't tried it. Maybe it would help my podcast.
Yeah.
Who knows? But the thing is, when he did get to work, he promoted his ideas with a sort of, messianic enthusiasm. And he amassed his followers all over Europe, and particularly in Britain.
Okay, so looking at British cities in the 1920s, they were still building quite classical civic buildings, I think. So Georgian-style houses. I suppose there were Art Deco cinemas. But of course, like France, there were plenty of slums, these vast spaces where there was mainly kind of slum-like buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. And Le Corbusier's followers in Britain, couldn't stand any of that. So they, like Le Corbusier, seem to have been gripped by this exciting idea that they could basically reshape society and lead human civilization into a brand new era. And basically, they didn't have much time for other people's views. So one architect, Maxwell Fry, instructed his colleagues, and I quote, "to address ourselves only to those capable of understanding us and let the rest go hang."
Gosh. So not very collaborative, not really a team player, perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps not. But at first anyway, so this is the 1920s and 30s, Le Corbusier's followers in Britain have very little real impact. But with the Second World War between 1939 and 45, everything changes. So the war leaves huge swathes of Britain in ruins. Countless people need to be rehoused. People want a fresh start, basically. And politicians see modernism as the solution.
How exciting. Well, I look forward to hearing how that all plays out. For everyone watching, thanks so much for joining us on Here for the History. Make sure to drop a comment. Let us know what you think about Le Corbusier and what your pseudonym would be if you were an architect. And make sure to like, hype and subscribe so you never miss an episode.
Chapter 2, Building Utopia. So Alice, it's April 1941 and we're in Birmingham. So families are huddled together in shelters as Germany's air force, the feared Luftwaffe, carries out an air raid on the city. Now, Birmingham wakes up the next day to an absolutely ruined city centre. And these scenes of destruction and the massive housing shortage it causes inspires a revolutionary zeal in a man called Herbert Manzoni, Birmingham's city engineer and surveyor, and a very important man for our story. Now, Manzoni is part of a generation of planners. So these are urban environment specialists employed by local authorities. And these planners are inspired by Le Corbusier's vision of progress. And like Le Corbusier, Manzoni didn't want to just replace bombed out homes and put things back the way they were. He wanted to completely remake the urban landscape. Now, I think we need to look at this from his perspective first, because even before these air raids, the city was dominated by old Victorian and Georgian infrastructure that was often crumbling. You've got tens of thousands of Birmingham residents living in unsanitary, back-to-back housing. Traffic in the city was terrible. So there were huge problems to address. And this was made much worse by the bombing. So at the time, it must have seemed like an opportunity to give the city a fresh start.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's like opening the door to this bright future. And I suppose we might lament the loss of old buildings today and their beauty in some ways, but for the people working in them, I imagine they'd be really excited by the prospect of new buildings with big open spaces where everything worked really, really well. Very practical and probably hugely exciting.
Yeah, so I chatted to the historian Otto Saumarez-Smith about this. So he's a member of the 20th Century Society, and he's written a wonderful book on the modern British city. And he basically makes the point that these buildings that they were planning to build were symbols of optimism at the time. And they basically went hand in hand with the ideals of the time. So the welfare state, the NHS, and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. I feel like there's a big but coming.
Well, if you look at it from the other perspective, Alice, Birmingham actually had some of the country's most impressive historic buildings, many of which survived the German bombs. But the man in charge of the city's redesign didn't seem to have much appreciation for history. So Herbert Manzoni famously said, links with the past are sentimental, and there was little of real worth in Birmingham's architecture.
Quite a statement, considering Birmingham actually had lots of pretty grand pieces of architecture. There was the old Gothic Bishop's Palace built by Augustus Pugin, who was famous for designing the Palace of Westminster in London. The city had some lovely neoclassical buildings, and there was the old Birmingham Central Library, which was pretty iconic. It had beautifully ornate carvings and an interior that was almost like a cathedral.
Yeah, absolutely. And Victorian Birmingham, was known for its remarkable civic pride, particularly expressed through all this architecture. But Manzoni, he still sets to work on his plan to remake the city. So he's instrumental in creating an Act of Parliament in the 1940s that's very important. So it's called the Town and Country Planning Act, which may sound boring, but it's hugely significant for our story. Basically, this act took building power away from the landlords, who could previously, build pretty much as they pleased, and put it in the hands of government planners like Manzoni. Plus, this new act actually incentivized replacing rather than repairing old buildings. So this change gave this new generation of planners the power to build these utopian cities. And the collateral damage of all this would be Britain's architectural heritage.
I see. I mean, it's just strange to think about people knocking down these historic buildings and just seeing them as sentimental bits of history. Tell me, Ben, what happened to Birmingham?
Well, like Le Corbusier, Manzoni gave the car pride of place, as it's basically the symbol of modernity. So his great plan was to build a massive ring road. Then, to make way for this ring road, he demolished all of the old buildings you've mentioned and more, including the old library, which was replaced by a new brutalist library.
Ah, okay. So brutalism, this is a new term. You might be familiar with it. There was a film that came out a year or two ago. But in short, it's a type of modern building that's pretty immediately recognizable because they're often made of raw, undecorated concrete, often absolutely massive, big, bold, geometric shapes. Some might say they're a bit dark and imposing. Other people might think they're incredibly dramatic.
Yeah, exactly. And brutalism falls under the umbrella of modernism. And the name supposedly comes from the French word brut, meaning raw. Um,
Oh.
yeah, and they're probably, I'd say, the most Marmite of all modernist styles.
And we've got a photo here of the brutalist version of Birmingham Central Library. This one built in the 1970s. And it does sit very squat in the city. It's got these concrete pillars around the base, holding up these 4 enormous horizontal slabs of concrete, a bit like an inverted pyramid, I think it's fair to say. And it's quite a stark contrast to some of the more historic-looking buildings around it.
And today, of course, there are plenty of people who really like brutalist architecture. So often you hear architectural critics describing it as bold and full-blooded or even heroic. Although it is interesting how they rarely refer to it as, beautiful. Anyway, listeners can make up their own minds about that. But again, polls consistently show large portions of the public dislike brutalist buildings. So the brutalist Birmingham Library was actually voted the second ugliest building in the country in 2008.
No comment, but I can sort of see why.
Anyway, in fairness to Manzoni, using steel, glass and concrete, as you've said, must have looked incredibly modern and innovative at the time. I imagine the first time they saw them was like when you or me first saw the smartphone. I actually remember vividly thinking how sleek and, modern it all looked. It was kind of a new world it symbolized. It's just that as the decades have gone past and we've got used to so many buildings that, are brutalist or these kind of boxy shapes, I think we've become inured to them and they look very dated now. Plus, concrete really doesn't age very well in the kind of damp English climate. Rain stains it, basically, if it's not looked after properly.
Yeah, and probably the fact it's always raining doesn't help. But there are some brutalist buildings people are quite fond of. I mean, the Barbican in London is an example, the National Theatre on the river too.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, it's a mixed bag. And it kind of depends who you ask. If you ask an architect or an architectural critic, they'll probably love it. If you ask someone on the street, it might get a different response. Who knows? Anyway, Manzoni's utopian dream for Birmingham basically turned into a disaster in the end, in many respects. So the ring road was so despised it became known as the concrete collar. And the brutalist library and Bullring shopping centre, which was one of the other new brutalist buildings put up, they were both knocked down in the end. But the architectural historian Simon Jenkins points out this isn't a story that's unique to Birmingham in any way. It's just one of many examples I could have picked. And it's basically a pattern you see across the country in which planners demolished cities' historic buildings and replaced them with modern buildings that were, all done with good intentions, but they proved to be incredibly unpopular and they'd often be later demolished themselves. And Jenkins, he calls this, and I quote, one of the greatest errors of modern British governments.
Wow. I mean, there's been a lot of decisions made by modern British government. That is quite a big statement from Simon Jenkins there.
I can't disagree with that. But as I said, we've got to try and be even-handed here. I think we need to judge modernism on its own terms. So people have different opinions on this, but most of the historians I've read say modernism was as much a social project as, an aesthetic one.
Okay.
And it was trying to deliver better lives for people. And although this is even the question I'm posing now is hugely contested, I think it must have significantly improved the lives of people living and working in those buildings, even if not everyone loves the look of them.
Well, perhaps you could see why it was like this for housing, but it is sad, I think, that so many impressive non-residential buildings, these great civic buildings, were destroyed. I mean, what did other people make of it? Surely there were some conservation experts who were up in arms.
Well, Alice, a big figure comes onto the scene at this point. So in the background through all this, through the 60s and 70s, opposition to demolishing historic buildings was growing among conservation groups, politicians, certain architectural writers. But then, famously, King Charles, then Prince Charles, got involved in the 1980s. So he basically lambasted modern architects for building what he called, and I quote, God-forsaken cities that consistently ignored the feelings and wishes of the mass of ordinary people in this country. And he even said that Birmingham's new brutalist library looked more like a place where books are burned rather than read. And this basically ignited what's known as the Battle of the Styles. Then in response, the head of the Royal Institute of British Architects told his colleagues to stick to their guns and say, sod you. But the press latched onto that and nicknamed his brutalist buildings Sod You architecture. And Charles, in the end, received apparently thousands of letters of support from the public.
Gosh, wow. I love the drama, high drama in the architecture world.
Yeah, exactly, a rare royal intervention. But the effect of all this was that by the 1980s, much of the state and the public had started to lose confidence in the idea of, master planners building these utopian modernist cities. And since then, there have been fewer examples of historic buildings being demolished like we saw in Birmingham. But then we do enter a new phase, because in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher's government took power away from the planners and encouraged private property developers to build instead. It's a big shift. And on top of this, she famously deregulated the money markets. So financial institutions are basically flush with cash, and her government incentivized businesses to build in special areas like Canary Wharf. So we start to get a massive boom in skyscrapers, which continued under successive Labour and Conservative government and has obviously massively changed our skylines since then.
Of course, and that's a fascinating thing. That's only been in the last 40, 50 years, and it's really transformative of the city. I think the results have been quite mixed. Most skyscrapers today are quite plain, aren't they? They're quite bland in their design. But then there are some quite high-profile ones, which are a bit more quirky, a bit more character. I know lots of people quite like the Shard, and then there's the walkie-talkie, although that has drawn quite a lot of criticism, hasn't it, over the years?
Yeah, it definitely has. But of course, Alice, like most non-residential buildings don't have those kind of huge budgets that you need to build the Shard or the walkie-talkie. Most buildings are usually built by developers in the hope of turning a profit and then basically selling them on. So they'll be made of mass-produced parts all over the world and imported, then assembled on site to fit very restrictive regulations. And the result of all this is the construction of basically very samey, low-quality commercial high-rises across our cities.
Okay, so we've moved from perhaps a more organic way of building, driven by civic pride and industry in the Victorian era, to this more centrally planned architecture, and it's driven by ideas of equality after the war, to this new era in which it's now driven largely by global commercial interests.
I couldn't have put it better myself, Alice.
Well, that's fascinating, bringing it up to the modern day. Thank you, Ben. And one of the things that I really enjoyed thinking about was when you look back at some of these buildings, you think, it's how could they possibly have knocked down all of these historic buildings and recreated the city in those ways? But actually, looking at those moments in time, trying to make a new start, it does perhaps start to make sense. And thanks for everyone on YouTube for watching. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Let us know in the comments what you think of brutalist architecture. And also do give us some suggestions for what we should talk about in other episodes. Don't forget to like, hype and subscribe so you never miss out on Here for the History. And until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.